All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to this webinar on adventures in NEPA, being offered by the Oregon Trails Coalition in partnership with our friends over at Central Oregon Trail Alliance, or CODA, and also with support from Larry O'Keefe from Team Dirt. We're really excited to be offering this today. We're also able to support the development of this content through support from Travel Oregon and the Oregon Trails Fund as part of all of the statewide training opportunities that we were able to help coordinate at the Trails Coalition in 2023. So this is part of that whole picture. And we're really glad you're here joining us today. We are recording this webinar, so if you miss something or have to leave, we will post the webinar recording up on the Oregon Trails Coalition blog and link to that in our next newsletter. You are invited to share questions at any time today in the chat or in the Q&A. We will probably not pause for questions until the end. If I see something that looks like it would be really helpful to clarify, I might barge in on Emmy and ask her a clarifying question if I see it. But most questions we'll address at the end, but you don't have to wait until the end to throw them into the Q&A. Feel free to get them down at any time. And then I would love to invite everyone to introduce yourselves to the other folks in the webinar. It's always nice when we can't see each other's faces still to have a sense of who's in the Zoom room together. So if you go to your chat, and then if you make sure you have everyone selected rather than just panelists, then you can introduce yourself to everyone. Feel free to share your name, any agency or organization you're affiliated with, or if you want to tell us where you're zooming in from, it would be great to know that. So feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to Emmy Andrews to get us started.
Okay, Steph, I see some comments saying the chat is not working. I assume you will work on that while I start here. So hi, everyone. Thanks so much for coming today. I am Emmy Andrews. I'm the executive director of CODA, Central Oregon Trail Alliance, as Steph said. And my partner in this, Larry O'Keefe, is also on the phone. He's with Team Dirt, and we're both very active members of Oregon Trails Coalition and just love working with them. And today we are going to be talking about adventures in NEPA. Obviously, NEPA being the National Environmental Policy Act. So with that, let's see, I got to click here to go to the educational objectives. So these, I also gave this talk at the summit back a month or so ago, and these are the educational objectives. And I'll tell you the story behind how we came up with this idea. Basically, before my time with CODA, I worked for about 15 years for an international consulting firm as a NEPA writer and project manager. So I have been doing NEPA as a practitioner for many, many years. I've worked with almost every federal agency that you can name, although conspicuously not so much the Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management, which are the two that I work with now. But you know, I kind of had that perspective for a long time, more from the agency, where it was like things like how long NEPA takes, you know, and I was the person who was like, oh, you know, why don't people understand? It takes a lot of time. And then I got into my current role with CODA, and I kind of, my perspective a little bit changed at, you know, working with a partner organization. And I was constantly around the kind of perspective that's like, why does it take so long? So I came up with this idea kind of to investigate the different perspectives of the land managers and the partners and sort of what each one faces, because I'm a big believer that when we have understanding of what each other are going through, kind of like a walk in other people's shoes, and we appreciate that, then we can have more empathy and have a better process. So that's kind of what I'm hoping to do here. And I'm also a real like action-oriented person. I like to break it down to like, what can people actually do? So this is also really about actionable steps that people can take to kind of better support each other and promote a smooth NEPA process. And yeah, my goal for everyone on this call is that you'll take away something that you can put to use, something that is actionable for you. Obviously, we're from a range of different perspectives. Some of us maybe are working with federal agencies, others are probably working with partner groups. Some of us are working on small projects, others are working on very big projects. So that what is going to be actionable for you is going to be different, but hopefully everyone will come away with something. So when I did this at the summit, I can have people raise hands, and that would take too much time here. But when I did do this at the summit, we kind of asked who was in the audience, and it was about a third land managers, people with federal agencies, a third working in partner groups, who might be trail stewardship groups for the most part, who are identifying issues that maybe need NEPA. A bridge is washed out, or an area needs comprehensive planning for the future for the multi types of recreation. So, and then other, which would be, maybe folks at other levels of government or just with other interests in the process. And then I also asked, what's your understanding of the NEPA process? Because this is definitely not like a NEPA 101. This is more geared at folks that have participated in the NEPA process in one way or another, and the planning that gets you up to doing the actual NEPA process. And then I have my little quote here just to remind ourselves, we have to, it's not trying to criticize anyone, but we definitely, we're going to look at things and talk about some things that aren't going well, but just with the idea to make them better, not to be mean or, criticize any person or anything. So what Larry and I did to investigate this and sort of what are the different perspectives and how can things be improved is we did a survey, and that was a 16-question survey. We had just shy of 50 people respond, and that was a good mix of partners and land managers. And then we followed up that survey with some interviews to kind of dive deeper into things that folks suggested and said. And so everything in here is basically, what did partners and land managers who are currently working on planning efforts and NEPA processes, what did they say? What are they experiencing? What are their ideas for making things better? That is what this data is all about. So the first thing, to talk about before we go into kind of how we make it better is that there's a lot to celebrate about NEPA, and there are a lot of things that folks in the questionnaires and in the interviews did celebrate about NEPA. And, primarily, I think for me, and a lot of the people said this as well, is that it makes government accountable. It makes decision-making transparent. And that is something, as American citizens that we really get to celebrate, that not everyone around the world has that sort of relationship with their government. So it's a really good thing. And it also very much helps with natural and cultural resource protection. It's the purpose of NEPA is not to protect natural and cultural resources. It's actually written to analyze impacts on both the human and natural environment. But certainly in the area that most of us work, natural and cultural resources out on public lands, that is a big thing. We want to balance what, human uses of the land with protection of those resources, and NEPA is an excellent process for, analyzing that and making sure that is done. And, just considering multiple alternatives, multiple ways to achieve a purpose and need, that's a great part of the NEPA process, and just really prompting folks to go through a robust process that does all these things, that involves the public, that looks at the problem and multiple solutions. And that helps us balance how we're using public land. So many, many things are great about NEPA. And so some of the multiple choice questions that we asked in the survey are also kind of show that NEPA is, maybe sometimes people get frustrated with NEPA, but it's actually working better than you might think. You can see here when asked how well the NEPA process works, a lot of people said, it's working okay or well. So we've got about 3/4 of folks saying that it's working okay or well. Nobody's saying it's working extremely well, but not many. We've also got a relatively small minority people saying that it's not working well at all. So that's a really good thing to see right off the bat. And then the time it takes is something that's always on people's minds, and you can see here as well. Obviously, the scale of the project affects the time that it takes. And so just simply looking at a graph of the time can't tell you everything you need to know. But you can see here that, from a year to 4 years, there's over 50% of projects in that realm. And, given the flavors of NEPA that are typically done, categorical exclusions and environmental assessments being the most common, that's not egregious. I would say this data to me says that it's working fairly well on time, even if we're often perceiving that it feels like it's taking longer than it perhaps should. Some of the other questions that we asked that were multiple choice, just how many NEPA projects are out there kind of waiting in the backlog. And you can see here 50% saying less than 10 projects. So that's, to me, not a huge backlog. As you move up through these other colors, there are some people that are in a position where there's a lot of backlog where they are, but a good number of people saying the backlog is relatively small. And then I hear a lot about NEPA litigation. So a federal agency proposing a project and then someone suing on that decision. So I wanted to ask the question, how many people have experienced that? And you can see, I actually thought it was going to be lower, the amount of people that had experienced litigation. In my time, 15 years or so as a practitioner, we never had a project that actually went to suit, although there were some that got close. But so here you can see 40% of people have been involved in projects went to litigation. So that's a fair amount. Okay, so the rest of this is going to be what people said and more ideas, not just that we're done with the things that are easy to to put in boxes. And these are more the interviews and the answers that people gave that were not just those that can be put into charts. So what we did was we put people's answers into categories, and you can see the 5 categories here: process, capacity, time, perception, and analysis. And then I've highlighted some of the squares over there so you can see both the agency folks responding and the partner folks responding. Process was the thing that they talked about the most. That's partially because that's the way we set up the survey, to just probe a little bit on process and things like communication and collaboration and expectations. So we'll spend a good bit of time on what we found there. When you look at the other categories, you can see that partners only, the thing they talked about the most other than process was time, the time that it takes. And that makes sense, obviously, because partners are like, man, we want to get through this process and get to the part where we implement it. And then, surprising to me, the thing that agencies talked about the most other than process was analysis, the technical analysis. They had a lot of thoughts on how to improve the technical analysis in the NEPA document itself. So I thought that was really cool and really illuminating that it's those agency folks with those ideas. And then when you look at both, everyone together, capacity was the thing that they talked about the most other than process. So that's, hiring and staffing and funding and all of those things. So the rest of this, we're going to move through those 5 categories and kind of what were some of the things that people said, and then what are the ideas for improvement of the process. Okay, here we go. So I'm not going to read all this. This is a lot of stuff. People said a lot of good things, but you can look at this while I kind of point out a few things. So in terms of the process, this is mostly not so much like the process of writing the NEPA document, but sort of that process of getting on the same page about what is it that you're doing, So there was a lot of stuff about collaboration, people that have participated in official collaboratives, multi-stakeholder collaboratives, where they're doing some sort of decision making, and there were very different opinions about how collaboration and those collaborative processes work. And it was very clear that some people had had good experiences in those environments and felt like, you know, that's where the real work gets done. And there were other people who had experiences where that it led them to believe, you know, you can't get, those processes don't work as well. And one of the real comments I found really interesting is this: when there are a lot of collaborative partners and you're trying to compromise, you end up with a zone of agreement that is sort of too small to meet the needs and to be worthy. So I thought that was a very interesting comment there. Then at the very bottom of this list, this one sort of was a bit of a one-off comment, but newspapers are mandated for public notices but are no longer widely read. That is a process thing with NEPA. That is a mandated thing. That's how you publish a notice that a NEPA document is available to the public for review. But the person that said that is very right. That is not necessarily the best way to reach a lot of people these days. So it's an interesting mismatch there. So those are the comments, what people kind of said about the process. And now we will move into what we can do to help each other. Things that both folks that are working for agencies and folks that are working for partner organizations can do to improve the process is really making that time up front, like in that sort of pre-NEPA. I think pre-NEPA is maybe a term of art that is going out of style, but sort of before you get to the point that the agency is writing a NEPA analysis, all of these, just making more time to work together and making more time to kind of understand who the stakeholders are, because they may not always be obvious, and making time to build those relationships, reach out. It can be very hard to build trust if people feel like when they hear about the fact that something is going on, if they feel like it is too late in the process for them to have meaningful input, it's very hard to build trust back from that place. So, you know, it can feel hard to get people involved when you're not sure, when things are open-ended. But in my experience and what a lot of the folks said that participated in this was, you know, it's better to get stakeholders involved early in the process. Aligning expectations. I mean, this is kind of one of those things that's way easier said than done. Is like, oh, define your priorities and define the project, and yeah, no problem. Just sit down and like write it out. But this can be quite a process, and, you know, really not underestimating what it takes to define the project and alternative ways to achieve the objectives and what the priorities are is can really help. You know, so all this is that kind of stuff you can do from the very, very first time you think about, hey, what do we want to do here to make things go much smoother down the line. And then last but not least, understanding collaborative processes. I have personally been involved in a number of collaboratives and still feel very like I don't fully understand, you know, consensus decision making and all of these different sort of terms of art or processes that go on in a collaborative to make good decisions and to document those well and to, you know, just make that a smooth process. So I would definitely recommend, and other folks echoed this, you know, if you're going to participate in a collaborative or form one, don't underestimate that and the need to really get training and put money behind making sure that collaborative process is very professional, because the outcome is only as good as the process itself and the way it is done. And then specifically additional ideas people had that agencies can do is, this came up a lot, is like helping partners understand the agency's internal workings and that, you know, terms and processes that federal agencies that are kind of like just so obvious to people that have worked in a federal agency for a long time, you know, the ID team and oh, this person has, this level of authority and does this type of thing. And the partner organizations, really, a lot of them just don't have an understanding of that stuff. So not taking for granted that partners understand how you do things and who the various players are, and taking the time to explain that to them is really, really helpful. And then this was a comment from a person who was like, taking the time to explain why. There are going to be things that partners advocate for, we want a trail here, or we want to, I don't know, that's one example. And it's just a non-starter for whatever reason. But taking the time to say why that is, there's an eagle nest here, or there's this type of habitat that can really promote understanding and decrease frustration. So that is a really good one. And then on the flip side, things that partners can do, the corollary to agencies taking the time to kind of explain the jargon and who has what role is on the partner side. You can also work to understand that stuff. There's resources on the web. You can work, a lot of times you can find someone in your volunteer pool who has maybe worked for an agency before and kind of help you understand that stuff. You can ask for an org chart. You can ask who the decision makers are, and make sure you take notes. I know that in my personal experience, I have had agency folks explain, oh, this person's in this role, and walk me through all that. And then I think I remember it in the moment, and then 6 months down the line, I don't. So like when an agency person takes time to explain that to you, like definitely write it down and share it with others in your organization. Backing up to the first bullet, getting NEPA training. NEPA is a relatively short law, and you can most definitely read the law itself and the agency's implementing regulations. The categorical exclusions are part of the Code of Federal Regulations. You can look those up and read them. You can ask the agency or look online, what are some recent NEPA documents that you like, and you can read those and look at what they say and how they analyze things, so that you start to understand how NEPA is done and how documents work and how analyses are done. And then recruiting someone who has NEPA experience into your team, whether you're a volunteer team or whatever that looks like, someone that can help your partner organization interpret some things, is a really, really good idea if you can do it. And the last bullet here, getting on the agency's plan of work. I think this is specific to the Forest Service. I'm not sure how this applies to BLM, but I know the Forest Service has a SOPA, the Schedule of Proposed Actions, and that is sort of a public-facing document. But behind that, there's a plan of work, because no surprise, they're kind of having to schedule the NEPA things. Like they can't necessarily just start on a project because, oh, this came up. They have a queue of things. And so getting on that plan of work is kind of the first step to being in the queue with your project. And you can very specifically ask, hey, can I get this project on the plan of work, and how would I do that? So those are some ideas that came up for partners. So that is the process. That's kind of like the most doozy of the different topics. So now if you think back to that chart with the 5 things, we're moving on to the second one of those 5, and that is capacity. And capacity is, I think, the most like straightforward, what the issues are. Not enough staff, not enough volunteers, people inexperienced in some of these things, job vacancies and a cumbersome hiring process, right? So not enough money. I would put that in the capacity bucket as well. So I think for capacity, the challenges are pretty clear. So what can we do about it? So ideas for improving capacity situations. Turnover is a really important one. I think more could be done to plan for turnover. Both, I put this in the both category because both agencies and partners have turnover. There's turnover in volunteers. There's turnover in, boards of directors and those kind of leadership. And there's definitely turnover with federal agencies. Federal agencies do a great job of, promoting their people through the ranks, and that is great for the people and for the agency's leadership development, but also means that whoever you're working with now, you may not be working with them for 5 or 10 years. You may be only working with them for 2 or 3. So a really good idea that a couple of people floated during this process was actually having a document that enshrines, if someone has committed to a project at an agency, if there are certain people with certain roles and responsibilities, if there's expectations around funding or timelines or any other aspect, really putting that in a document. This is not something I think that is commonly done now, or at least in my sphere of experience, it has not been, but I think it would be a really good idea, because then when a new person comes in, there's a little less of that, oh, well, what's your opinion? And it's more like, hey, we've worked out certain things, and here it is. These are the agreements that we've already made about this project. So I think that's a really good idea for both groups to participate in. And then agencies, there was a lot of folks talked about, asking partners for help. And definitely some of folks saying, like, there's a lot that partners could do to support the NEPA. My specific organization, we've funded supporting studies when there's been opportunity to do that. We've raised money and made those studies happen. We can sometimes help with, well, a lot of times, we help with data gathering and that kind of thing. So agencies, advice would be to ask your partners for help. You might be surprised how much they can really help you with different things. And then also being open to third-party contractor support. I don't see BLM and the Forest Service doing that as much, and that would definitely be sort of borne out by my own personal career, where, in 15 years of supporting federal agencies, I rarely supported Forest Service or BLM. I do think they tend to do NEPA in-house a lot more than some other agencies do. So that may be something that we see coming more in the future for agencies, you certainly can't, the agency folks have a lot of knowledge about the area and the different resources. So it's not something you can just whole hogs put off on a contractor, because that contractor has a lot of getting up to speed. But there are certainly parts of the process where contractors can be very helpful, and it can save the agency some time and build some capacity there. And then partners, really working to build your staff and volunteer capacity. Like if you're all volunteer, maybe working towards having paid staff, and just building that volunteer capacity. And then the corollary to agencies asking for help is partners volunteering to assist. You can talk to your agency counterpart and say, hey, what can we do? We'd love to gather some data. We'd love to help with, your admin record or something, if there's opportunity to do that. And then a really interesting suggestion that came up in the process was advocating for more agency funding. Agencies are really not in a position to question or show public dissatisfaction with their funding levels, but partners are free to do that and to say, hey, these agencies are underfunded, understaffed, and really advocate for our federal land managers to get the resources that they need to do things, to have the capacity that they need. So that's really something when partners, if you're thinking about your advocacy goals, to really think about how can you do that? How can you be a voice for federal agencies to get the resources that they need? Great. So that is capacity. So now we're on to the third category. That's time. Obviously the sort of classic, this was sort of what motivated me to look into this in the first place, is in the classic sort of tension here is between needing to have patience and understanding that it takes a lot of time to do a robust analysis and process, and then also not wanting it to take forever. And one of the things that several people brought up, which is really important to note, is that time does have an effect, right? Something taking an amount of time, there are times when resources out in the field are being affected while the NEPA process is going on. Maybe there's an erosion issue or something, and you need to go through the NEPA process to determine what to do. But meanwhile, it's getting more and more eroded, right? That can certainly happen. So recognizing that the taking of time is not necessarily without consequence, I think is a really important thing to keep in mind. Especially when this bullet here, projects with negligible impacts are delayed for years, especially when logic would tell you that a project likely has very low impacts. So anyway, I actually found a paper that investigated these timelines, and it was sort of NEPA. There are no requirements currently that I'm aware of that federal agencies really have to report these things. So the data in this paper is kind of the data that they could find, which is why this is sort of a random selection of agencies, because some agencies are tracking these metrics and others are not. But you can see here, the time for a categorical exclusion was everything from more than half a year to just a couple of days. And again, the type of projects that these are and how routine they are may be very different, and that can be informing the time, but definitely helps you see some perspective. And then again, time for an environmental assessment varying quite a lot as well between different agencies.
Emmy, I know this is not a 101, but could you just take a moment to describe what a categorical exclusion versus an environmental assessment is very, very briefly?
Sure. There's basically 3 levels of NEPA. A categorical exclusion is just a very basic document because it is categorically excluded from a deeper analysis, because there have been a lot of, it's a pretty routine action for an agency. And so it has become a categorical exclusion. So that's a much more routine, smaller project type of NEPA. And then an environmental assessment is a more of a distinct, unique project and needs a deeper assessment. So an environmental assessment will be a bigger document, has a more robust process for public involvement and those kinds of things. And then an even higher level is the environmental impact statement, which is a very, only the biggest projects go through that. And it is a very intense document with a lot of public involvement requirements. Hopefully that helps.
Thank you.
Cool. Yes, so then time, ideas for improvement. I think both agencies and partners can implement the other ideas for improvement that we went over in the process and capacity categories, and those will improve the timeline. Although I would caveat that it doesn't always mean making it shorter. I mean, sometimes some of these things that we talked about, especially in process of involving stakeholders really early and doing a robust, thoughtful process around, how the different stakeholders are going to be affected and how to do that in a smart way. Sometimes that stuff can actually increase the kind of before you get into the actual document writing, but it can be time well spent if it saves on the back end with folks being dissatisfied with the outcome or not, and wanting to use administrative remedies to basically fight that outcome. So that's my caveat. It doesn't always shorten the timeline, but it does improve the overall process. And then agencies, this came up a couple of times, especially as partner agencies grow their capacity and have staff and are becoming stronger organizations. That definitely provides more support to the agencies, but it also means those partner agencies need to plan for grants and staff and volunteer capacity. And without a timeline, it's very, very hard for them to do that. So I know agencies, it can be hard. You don't want to commit to a timeline because you don't know that won't change. But without any sort of timeline, it's just very, very hard for partner agencies to do the type of planning to run their business the way that they need to run it. And then partners, I think accepting that it will take time is a really big one, is a good idea for improvement. One thing we have done in our organization is, when volunteers get involved in planning, and we have a trail planning committee, and when they join that committee, we kind of really talk to them about like the things you're going to work on may not come to pass for 5 or 10 or maybe even more years. And so kind of setting their expectations that you may not even be involved in this organization anymore as a volunteer by the time this project actually makes it to the finish line, if it ever does, because there's no certainty in NEPA that the project will come to pass at all. So setting that expectation for folks can help decrease the frustration, like, oh, it's taking so long. If you set the expectation for them that it could be 5 or 10 years, then it won't feel like it's taking so long. It's just the psychology of it. So those are some ideas there. Okay, so now we're to our 4th out of 5 categories. Hanging in there, hopefully, everyone. And this is about perception. Looking back on it, I'm not sure that's my favorite word for this category, but this was a lot about, you can read these, the impacts and how the project is perceived, or one of this first bullet, I love this comment from one of the people that we surveyed. Effects are manifested for the sake of analysis. That's a very interesting observation, that when a specialist is writing a document, it feels like you haven't done your homework if you say, oh, there aren't going to be any effects. And obviously ecological systems, which we're mostly working with on public lands, are infinitely complex. So there's almost no situation where there's like no effect of doing a project. An effect of changing anything changes other things. It has this sort of butterfly effect, if you will, but keeping those effects in perspective and, understanding the scale of impacts. Obviously a restoration project where, timber is going to be cut on 30,000 acres is very different from, building 5 miles of trail. And so when the scale of a NEPA project changes, sometimes like the smaller the project, the more the individual components of that project get put under the microscope. And there was a lot of comments from both partners and agencies bringing that up. And then also kind of in terms of opposition to projects and potential of projects going to litigation. I really liked this comment. It's most of the way down in the bullet list. Appeals are always a possibility, even projects with broad support. So that's a really good point. And so the same paper that we looked at before also dealt with NEPA litigation. I thought this was interesting because it sort of looms out there as this thing, like, what is it and how often does it happen? And so there are some statistics on this. The NEPA litigation rate, again, this is a white paper from a few years ago. There isn't any like 2023 data, but for the data that are available, the NEPA litigation rate is pretty low. It's 1 out of every 450 decisions. And you can see the bottom left, that's comparing NEPA litigation to all types of litigation. So NEPA litigation is by no means somehow like bigger than other types of civil litigation against the federal government. So that's a very good thing to recognize. It's not like more NEPA projects get litigated than other types of projects. And top right, the NEPA litigation rate is declining. And that statistic is specifically for the primary federal land management agencies. So that is BLM, Forest Service, Park Service, and Fish and Wildlife specifically. And then the government prevails in or has a neutral outcome, which is typically them saying more analysis needs to be done and kind of putting it back on the agency to do more in over 80% of cases. So the government is either upheld in their decision or is told, to do some more analysis before they kind of commit to their decision in most cases. So yeah, I think that is a very interesting stat as well. So wait, here we go. What should we keep in mind? Ideas for improvement on these types of issues. For both agencies and partners, I think being aware of negativity bias is really important. I am really into the psychology kind of behind how the things that we experience affect us. And negativity bias, if you don't know, I use the example, like if I go for a hike and I pass 50 people on my hike and 49 of them like smile and say good morning, and one person is kind of grumps by me and like maybe gives me a dirty look or something, and then I go home to my partner and he's like, how's your hike? And I'm not going to say, oh wow, I passed 49 people and they were also friendly and nice. I'm going to say, man, there was this one person who was just grumpy. And that's negativity bias at work in your life. So just being aware of that sometimes we tend to put too much focus on when someone is against the project. We can just psychologically, because of the way we're wired, kind of give that too much weight and sort of lose perspective on the good that the project would do and the number of people support it. So I put it typically as like opposition is somewhat the norm in the broader environment that we live in, as pretty much everyone is aware. And a little bit of opposition doesn't necessarily mean that the project shouldn't proceed or that the process has somehow failed, nor does it mean, from what we saw in the previous slide, that litigation is likely. So just having some perspective on that, I think, is good for both parties. Then for agencies, a lot of those comments about the magnitude of impacts, came from folks that are working for agencies. So really making sure making sure to match the analysis and the protection measures, mitigations to the magnitude of the potential impacts is a really important thing. Probably another really good example of something that's easier said than done. But that's just something to really think about. And then partners, there's a lot you can do. It's not easy and it's not always fun, but there's a lot you can do to engage other stakeholders that might have some concerns about projects that are being proposed to expand recreation or what have you, and really talking them through it and engaging them on what you're really trying to do, so that there aren't misunderstandings about the scale and what you want to do. And if that can be hard. I mean, there have been situations that I've been involved personally where, we probably should have like literally gone door to door or something like that. And it would be hard and scary to engage those folks that aren't on the same page as you, but it can really pay off. And you can learn a lot from like why folks have concerns. So that's something I think partners can do more of to help the process. Okay, last but not least, the analysis. And if you recall from that little chart when we started out with these 5 areas, this was, again, mostly agencies that had these comments, that we need more categorical exclusions, that beneficial impacts are not sufficiently analyzed, and the impacts of not doing a project aren't always analyzed perhaps in the way they should, that a library of existing NEPA documents could be leveraged to understand what's already been analyzed and how things have been analyzed and what data are available to support an analysis. So there's a lot of ideas from folks about how the technical analysis in the document itself could be improved. And what we can do about that, NEPA was actually just amended very recently by the Fiscal Responsibility Act of 2023. And no surprise, agencies are thinking about these improvements, and some of them have now gotten codified. And so the first up is this study of technologies that might help improve public accessibility and transparency. I read this as potentially one day becoming some sort of library of NEPA documents. The way this is worded, this is just a first step to that. So I wouldn't say that it necessarily will be that, but there are some baby steps in that direction, it looks like. Also, the amendment of the law allowed different agencies to adopt other agencies' categorical exclusions. And I forget which one it is now, but it's either the Forest Service or BLM has a categorical exclusion specifically around trail building, and the other one doesn't. And so potentially they could adopt that categorical exclusion, it's not as easy as just being like waving a wand and saying, I adopt this categorical exclusion. There's a pretty robust process for doing it, but it is possible. And also the law changes and what is allowed in terms of third-party contractors and even partner organizations conducting NEPA analyses and actually writing EAs. I think this is aimed at sort of energy and infrastructure type of businesses, things like putting up utility lines or something over I think what this is, but it definitely does open this door wider. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. And yeah, then partners, a couple things that I think folks can do, helping to raise funds to use third-party contractors. I mean, one of the barriers that may be existing for agencies is not having the funds to do that. So if you can help for supporting studies or that type of thing, that would be really good. And then also in terms of the beneficial effects and the adverse effects of taking no action, that's something that partners are in a really good position to explain to agencies and, write it down and send it to them like, hey, this is the way we see this. If this erosion gets worse, this is what's going to happen. And that can help. They might actually we wrote up some stuff about how we would use machines to do trail building, and they put it into the NEPA document. So that was a really good, obviously that was helpful to the agencies. So there's some thoughts there. Okay, we're almost at the end, so we can get to questions. Real quick slide on collective action ideas. I mean, obviously my goal for this is that each person has your unique situation, and I hope each person can take away something that you can put to use. But there are some ideas in here that we could sort of all as a collective group work on. And Steph's like Oregon Trails Coalition is all about like convening and educating. So doing more things to help convene folks to review progress on projects, to facilitate NEPA education. At the summit, I asked the audience that was there how many folks would be interested in like a NEPA 101 type of thing, specifically geared at our world of recreation. And like 95% of people raise their hands. So that's something I personally am going to be looking to contribute to folks. And then Oregon Trails Coalition actually wrote this very cool document, Ready, Set, Plan. And this is the link for it. You can copy that. Or I think you can just Google it and it's quite easy to find. And it includes Appendix B is sort of like a checklist when you're, or not a checklist, but like a worksheet when you're preparing, when you're advocating for a project, like, hey, we want to expand the trail system here or whatever, kind of walks you through all the data that would be needed to work between a partner agency and an agency to really think through how that project would work and if it would work. So, as well as that document being chock full of just general planning ideas. So definitely check that document out. And a few other resources. The CEQ, the Council on Environmental Quality, has a ton of stuff on their website. The Citizens Guide to NEPA is very readable. There are a lot of other things there. Forest Service has some NEPA training on its website. I didn't watch this series, but there's a series on public participation, and we didn't talk about it, but public comments are not really a vote. A helpful public comment to an agency is not, I like the project, I don't like the project. So these videos give you some thoughts on that, like as a member of the public, how to write a helpful public comment when public comment periods are on. And then Gabe, I think your document is out, but I didn't have a link to it. This was a similar investigation that Gabe did last year at the summit, just sort of trail development triumphs and pitfalls, as it says. So this is a really good document sort of about how to have a successful project. And then YouTube, I would not vouch for how good the videos on YouTube are about NEPA, but there's probably some good ones in there if you wanted more like bite-size NEPA planning. So that is it. Thanks for hanging in there. I know NEPA can be like kind of intense, but I love it. And this is my email and Larry's email. And if you want to, if you have a specific question or something you want to hear more about, you're welcome to email me. I always love to help folks to the extent that I can. I mean, so I was thinking about that thing that if you've done something for 10,000 hours, you're supposedly a master. And I'm like, gosh, I've probably got double that amount of hours on NEPA, but I don't feel like a master. But it's just such a broad topic. But I'm happy to share whatever perspective or information I do have. So feel free to get in touch. And we have a few minutes for questions, I think.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to ring in, and Larry shared in the Q&A that it's the Forest Service that has the categorical exclusion on trails and not as opposed to BLM. So he provided that clarification to that question earlier. There was a couple of questions about the fiscal responsibility legislation as it relates to trail construction. And I think folks are curious about more of the rulemaking on that. So I don't know if Emmy, if you have more info on either the categorical exclusion of borrowing other agency categorical exclusion piece, or the other question was if the Forest Service has yet to have prescribed procedures to allow a project sponsor to prepare a NEPA document under the supervision of the agency. Like if we know any more about process or protocols for either of those things.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I see this. So to that one, Randy, your question, my guess is no, because this is all I think the Fiscal Responsibility Act itself was just a matter of months ago. So I'm going to venture that the Forest Service has not had time to do that, though I don't 100% know. And then the other question about the CE, I did look into that, and Larry, you might be able to pop in on this. It was sort of like they have to, I remember reading it, but it's not coming to my mind super well, but it was like they have to somehow demonstrate, I don't know. There was a rather what seemed like an intense process prescribed for how to adopt a categorical exclusion, and there were some approvals and different things. So it was, but I can't, doing a very bad job of bringing to mind the details of it.
So more to learn there for all of us.
I know, it was definitely hearing that the law had actually been changed was definitely a moment for me where it was like, oh my gosh, I've been out of the game for 3 years. Like I was thinking about at the summit, I used to go to conferences where the whole conference was about NEPA. And now I'm like, there's this new ruling and I haven't even dug into it or had all my buddies tell me all the nuances of it. And so, yeah, I apologize. I don't know a lot of detail about that rulemaking.
We also had a couple of questions about litigation, just generally if you have more information about what types of NEPA projects are ending up in litigation, as well as a more specific question of if you've run across any case studies where litigation was used in favor of a REC project. And an example of where this hasn't happened yet to date, but was the Lemon Gulch project. Could there be a case for disregarding the Forest Service, disregarding their own public comment, their own science, and all the process that went into that? Have you ever seen a case litigated like that?
I have not. Doesn't mean that it hasn't happened, although I'm not aware of it. I would say NEPA is very, certainly just because an agency embarks upon a NEPA process and writes a document, they are not, the no action is always one of the alternatives, and that's required by law that they analyze the no action, and they can always take no action. They can abandon a NEPA process in the middle. There is a lot of latitude for agencies to, there's nothing that says if you've embarked on a NEPA process and analyzed alternatives, you've got to pick some sort of action and move forward. So, as much as I do not agree with the Lemon Gulch quote decision, because the way they stated their decision is that they did not decide, they did not make a decision or choose one of the alternatives. That it is well within, the way I understand it, it's well within their, right to just abandon the whole thing. So I don't know.
And generally, in terms of, do you have any sense of projects, NEPA projects that have gotten litigated? Do we know what, like, any sense of how many of those are even recreation projects? I mean, I imagine that number is even much smaller for recreation projects.
Yeah, right. I mean, there may be some aspect of recreation in projects that have gotten NEPA that got litigated, but they weren't fully about recreation. I would say, like, my understanding is that because there are no, depending on the level of analysis you're doing, and you have to be doing, I think, an environmental impact statement to not pick, with an environmental impact statement, you can be like, we're going to do this thing and it's going to have some bad effects. I mean, I did a lot of stuff for the military, and like, to do the training and have the readiness that our country has, like, some effects happen for sure. And the federal government can just disclose that through the NEPA process, and they can actually take those actions. You don't have to mitigate all of the effects. There are cases where you can't mitigate all of the effects. So NEPA can result in a project that has some pretty intense effects. What often gets litigated is the Administrative Procedures Act. So what is actually alleged is that the government did not follow the NEPA process robustly or completely or as prescribed by law and their own implementing regulations. So that's why you saw on that NEPA, the litigation slide, that about 20% of the outcomes are neutral. That's basically telling them, you got to go back and improve this part of your process or part of your analysis before you can make a decision and take action. So it's not really the action itself that you can say, oh, you shouldn't have this effect. It's more the process that is what gets litigated.
I want to, going back to our previous topic, I want to note that Larry has noted in the Q&A that he doesn't believe that any of the agencies have actually incorporated the new law into their operating policies at this stage. So just wanted to close that out. Another question from Eddie Kessler is that the Forest Service staff they work with have talked about potentially using contractors, but they will still need to review the data. So the question is, what work other than actually writing up the technical docs do you think are appropriate for contractors?
Yeah, so my typical assignment as a contractor would be sort of managing the whole process, keeping us on the timeline, writing the document, writing often the consultation letters, managing the public involvement process. So, we would be the people that would put out the public notices and take in all the comments and analyze those. And, so we kind of did a lot of the work, but then it was the government folks that were providing us the data that we used in the analysis. And then also every step of the way, reading the document, providing comments, providing direction, answering questions, because ultimately the agency does own the responsibility for that. And there's a big transfer of knowledge that obviously has to happen. The agency folks, they know their resource management plan or whatever so well, and then when a new consultant comes on, they have to read that resource management plan and get up to speed. I did stuff all over the country, and so I'd have to learn about Hawaii and learn about whatever. And so yeah, there's a lot that a contractor can do, but the government is sort of like hand in hand with them every step of the way.
Thanks. I just want to note we are at 1 o'clock. We have just a couple more questions in the Q&A, and Emmy has pre-committed to being willing to go through those. But for folks who need to leave, we will post the recording of the webinar up on the Oregon Trails Coalition blog by the end of the week, along with and we'll put direct links to the resources that Emmy shared, because it can be hard to grab those from PowerPoints on Zoom, I know. So we'll make those a lot easier to go to. But just another couple of comments. You know, one I think was really a comment, but I think there's an interesting question in there, and it was around, you know, the current requirements for sharing public comment in newspapers and how folks are not, you know, who are really involved in projects don't even necessarily get notification that project is out for public comment, you know, in order to help share that with stakeholders. So, you know, I guess, you know, a process of how can we improve that process. And then the other last question I wanted to share was, are there thoughts on what kind of advocacy or lobbying might be helpful at the highest levels of Bureau Land Management and Forest Service to advocate for high-level changes or improvements in the NEPA process and funding? And I'll say this says NEPA process and funding. I will say there's, you know, always an opportunity through the federal budget appropriations process for advocates to advocate for more funding and counts like the CMTL account, you know, for the Forest Service, which is, you know, where a lot of trail and recreation and transportation kinds of projects get funded out of. It's like funding for trails and roads and such. So, you know, participating and sharing support for budget appropriations for agencies for those specific accounts that benefit recreation, I think is a big one. But as far as where to advocate for changes in NEPA process, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's an interesting, I mean, the thing that comes to my mind, but I don't think it actually fits with advocacy, but is that one thing that I see, and I've also heard from others, is that a lot of times people move into NEPA for a very small part of their career. So a lot of folks like actually practicing NEPA in the federal government are rather inexperienced at it. And it is very complicated of like, what is okay and what is allowed and what is the right level of mitigation and how do you define something as significant or not? And like, so that can really affect. So if there were any ways to encourage folks to stay in NEPA longer, so you would have that seniority and you wouldn't have like kind of the brain drain, I think that would really help the process. You know, when I've worked with folks at agencies that they're very confident in the process and they're confident in sort of what is okay, that has been a much better process, you know, than when folks are like, every little criticism kind of is like, oh no, what do we do about that? And, you know, every little like, oh, here's a potential impact. Oh no, we have to mitigate it to zero. You know, that's not true. So folks that kind of that have more seniority and kind of understand, okay, you know, this is sufficiently mitigated at this level, that can be really helpful to the process. And so, yeah, a way to keep senior practitioners in the field would be a really good thing. And on the newspaper thing, you know, it's interesting. This is another area where my understanding isn't quite deep enough, but my understanding is that agencies can actually expose themselves to some risk if they are not very fair in the way they're engaging everyone, and the opportunities for engagement for all people, all citizens, is equal. So the newspaper, while a little anachronistic, is the way to kind of level that playing field. Like everyone had an equal opportunity to see that newspaper notice, right? And so if they're having a mailing list, let's say hypothetically, I mean, that mailing list is not going to be 335 million people long, which is around the population of the United States. So where do they cut it off? You know, and there's always that opportunity, as I understand it, that someone who didn't get on that mailing list could then say, you know, I wasn't given a fair opportunity to participate in this process. So the newspaper is anachronistic, but checks that box of being fair. And I don't know what the future will hold for that, because the anachronistic part to me is starting to outweigh the like trying to level the playing field problem. It's not working the way it is.
And is it fair if there's generational differences or other differences with people who access that source for news versus other sources of information? So
yeah, arguably a lot of newspapers, it's kind of behind a money firewall. Like you can't necessarily get a newspaper for free. So is that fair? There's a lot of questions there. So
well, big thanks, Emmy, for this very informative and engaging presentation with lots of practical ways that folks can improve the process. Really grateful to be able to share this with our coalition partners. And I'll say just one last time, we will post the recording on our blog. So if you missed any of it and you want to come back or you want to share it with a colleague, it will be easy to access there, and we'll share the links as well.
Yes, so feel free to contact me if you have a specific situation you'd like to discuss more. Love keeps me on my toes with this NEPA stuff.
Great. Thanks, everybody. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and thanks especially to you, Emmy.
Yeah, thanks everybody for coming.
Bye-bye.
Bye.